On May 28, 2025, Kenya's capital Nairobi transformed into the epicenter of African military power. Amidst the glint of uniforms, rows of medals and diplomatic handshakes, more than 38 chiefs of defense forces from across the continent gathered for an unprecedented summit. This was not just a meeting of military minds. It was a declaration of alliances, visions, and political postures in a continent undergoing strategic realignment. But amidst the impressive show of unity and protocol, one empty chair spoke louder than all the others. The seat reserved for Burkina Faso, currently led by one of Africa's youngest and most controversial military rulers, Ibrahim Traoré. He was absent. No official envoy, no junior officer, not even a courtesy message or formal excuse. Burkina Faso had gone completely silent, as if it had never been invited. Why would a military leader known for his fierce campaign against insurgents skip a high-level defense summit that brought together the continent's elite military leadership? Was it a scheduling conflict or a deliberate political maneuver? Traoré's silence quickly ignited speculation across social media and geopolitical analysis circles. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Washington to Moscow, observers began asking, why didn't Traoré come to Nairobi? In this video, we decode that absence not as a coincidence, but as a calculated political message. A silent declaration about how Ibrahim Traoré views his role in Africa's emerging power structure. To understand why Ibrahim Traoré, the military leader of Burkina Faso, chose not to attend the African Defense Summit in Nairobi, we must begin with the fundamental political differences between him and the host government Kenya. Under the leadership of President William Ruto, Kenya has become one of Africa's most vocal opponents of military coups. On every international platform, Ruto has made it clear military regimes have no place in a modern African political landscape. He has consistently called for the expulsion of unelected governments from the African Union, describing coups as political bad manners. Ibrahim Traoré, however, is a direct product of such a coup. In 2022, at just over 30 years old, he led a military overthrow of a civilian government amid Burkina Faso's worsening security crisis. Though hailed as a hero by some for his tough stance against terrorism, many African governments, especially those committed to democratic governance, see Traoré as a symbol of instability and democratic backsliding. The relationship between Kenya and Burkina Faso has therefore always been cold, if not non-existent. There is no public image of a handshake between Traoré and Ruto, no bilateral meetings, no strategic partnerships. While Kenya champions electoral democracy, Traoré has crafted an image of a new generation military leader, tough anti-Western and openly defiant of international norms. Tensions have become more pronounced, considering Kenya's reactions to recent coups in the Sahel region, where Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have formed a new military alliance. President Ruto hasn't only condemned leaders like Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger, Traoré's close ally, but has also pushed regional bodies like ECOWAS and the African Union to impose harsh sanctions and diplomatic isolation on these military-led regimes. In this context, does it make sense that Traoré avoided Nairobi? Absolutely. His absence was not merely a dodge, it was a strategic retreat. By not showing up, he avoided cold shoulders, public criticism, and potential diplomatic confrontation in a space where he was never going to be welcomed. More importantly, his silence delivered a clear political message. Traoré does not seek validation from governments that reject his leadership. His non-attendance was an act of defiance, reinforcing his image as an independent actor, unbound by the diplomatic courtesies of traditional African politics. Beyond political tensions with the host country Kenya, another major reason behind Ibrahim Traoré's absence from the Nairobi Defense Summit was the presence of an unwelcome figure, General Michael Langley, commander of the United States Africa Command, U.S. AFRICOM. For many pro-Western African nations, Langley's attendance signaled a strong U.S. commitment to African security, but for Traoré, who is steadily distancing Burkina Faso from Western influence, his presence was a red flag. It was no coincidence that Traore chose to stay home when Langley was set to be the guest of honor. Just a month earlier, in April 2025, General Langley publicly accused Traore's regime of misusing Burkina Faso's gold reserves. He implied that the profits were being funneled to sustain an authoritarian military government. This statement ignited waves of anti-US protests in Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Liberia, with demonstrators brandishing slogans like "Hands off Africa" and "Down with imperialism." For Traore, this was not merely diplomatic criticism, it was a public insult from the most senior US military official in Africa. And to make matters worse, that same official was the central figure at the Nairobi summit. Traore's absence can be interpreted as a clear message to Washington: we do not welcome commands or control. This is a leader who has already expelled French troops, severed ties with ECOWAS, and embraced strategic alignment with Russia and Sahel, allies like Mali and Niger. Sitting at the same table as the US, military's top African commander would directly contradict the defiant independent stance Traore has carefully cultivated. There's also a broader geopolitical layer to this. Observers noted that the Nairobi summit, despite its African branding, bore the fingerprints of Western strategy. With Langley at the forefront and American involvement heavily publicized, it felt more like the groundwork for a Western-aligned defense architecture than a pan-African collaboration. In that context, Traore's decision not to attend was more than an avoidance. It was a strategic act of resistance. He sidestepped an unnecessary confrontation while reinforcing his image as a leader who defends sovereignty and resists foreign intervention. For him, Nairobi wasn't just a military conference. It was a diplomatic stage he refused to step onto. Ibrahim Traoré is not just a military officer, he is a carefully crafted political media symbol. From his image to his messaging, from his words to his silence, everything serves a single consistent strategy to portray himself as a strong, uncompromising leader, fiercely anti-neo-colonial and independent from all forms of foreign pressure. In the rare international events he does attend, Traoré appears ready for combat, full military attire, sidearm on his belt, surrounded by bodyguards, eyes cold and deliberate. He doesn't walk into summits to negotiate. He arrives to assert himself as the face of a movement of forgotten nations reclaiming their voice. His absence from Nairobi was not an act of avoidance, it was a calculated media strike. In today's political landscape, refusing to attend a high-profile summit, especially when nearly everyone else is present, is a powerful form of messaging. Traoré didn't need to give a speech or release a formal statement. His silence alone became headline material across social media and international analysis forums. This media tactic echoes his broader communication approach with the West. Traoré rarely engages in interviews with American or French media. Instead, he appears frequently at press events with Russian, Malian, and Nigerian officials, his allies in the anti-imperialist Sahel bloc. Every photo, every handshake, and every public appearance with these leaders is maximized by his government's media apparatus to reinforce a single narrative: Traoré is the symbol of resistance. His administration also maintains tight control over domestic media platforms. His speeches are often interwoven with quotes from Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary hero of Burkina Faso, positioning Traoré as the ideological successor to the anti-colonial legacy of the past. By not appearing in Nairobi, Traoré also avoided potential diplomatic ambushes where even a single photo or handshake could be misconstrued. In a media age where a raised eyebrow can be spun into a geopolitical crisis, choosing not to show up is sometimes the most effective way to control the narrative. In essence, Traoré's absence was not a lack of engagement. It was an expertly executed media strategy. Every move, every silence, every appearance is part of a larger communication framework designed to project the image he wants the world to see: a defiant, unyielding, and unowned African leader. Ibrahim Traoré's absence from the African Military Summit in Nairobi was not a silent oversight. It was a statement. Not one made through words, but through action. A deliberate gesture directed at Africa and the world. He is not a leader in isolation, but a man actively reshaping the continent's relationship with global powers. In a world where appearances carry as much weight as speeches, Traoré understands the power of not showing up. While generals, presidents, and diplomats gathered in Nairobi for handshakes, photo ops, and keynote addresses, Traoré chose a different form of communication, one that was bolder, more defiant. He left his seat empty and let the world speculate. No explanation, no apology, just silence with strategic intent. That empty chair in today's geopolitical context reflects a growing trend across Africa, the rise of anti-Western sentiment, and a strategic shift towards sovereign, self-defined power structures. Alongside Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso is building not only a military alliance, but an ideological one, where nations choose their own paths, select their own partners, and reject external pressure when it conflicts with national interests. So the real question isn't, why didn't Traoré attend? The better question is, what was he saying by not attending? The answer lies in the broader vision his government is pursuing, to redefine what it means to be an African nation, resilient, independent, and unafraid to challenge the global order. Not everyone agrees with Traoré's path. Critics warn that military-led governments could undermine democratic processes, opening the door to unaccountable, opaque rule. But even his harshest critics must admit he has reignited a vital debate. Can Africa rise on its own terms without mimicking Western templates? Traoré's image, a young soldier with a pistol on his hip, eyes locked on the camera, refusing to bow to anyone, is quickly becoming a symbol for many young Africans. A symbol of defiance, of sovereignty, of the desire to reclaim Africa's future by Africa for Africa. To his supporters, Traoré is more than a transitional president. He is the embodiment of a movement. In the end, Nairobi wasn't missing Traoré. Nairobi was the place Traoré deliberately avoided to protect his message, preserve his stance, and maintain a long-term strategy. That empty chair may have lacked a man, but it was overflowing with meaning. The act of not attending a summit is not uncommon in international diplomacy. But when the person absent is a young, controversial military leader who rose to power through a coup and is now reshaping his country's entire foreign policy, his absence becomes more than a matter of logistics. It becomes a political highlight, a media maneuver, a deliberate act, and more importantly, a strategy. 1. Traoré and the rise of symbolic politics in Africa. Ibrahim Traoré is betting on a new form of soft power symbolism. Without making lengthy speeches, staging major conferences, or seeking validation from legacy institutions, he is carving out an identity as a bold and unpredictable leader. And ironically, it is this defiance of tradition that makes him stand out in a sea of leaders who follow the diplomatic playbook. His absence from the Nairobi summit can be seen as a calculated, controlled retreat. He stayed away knowing full well that all eyes would be on him, and rather than risk being drowned out by staged handshakes or cold diplomatic stares, he sent a message louder than words: I don't need to play by old rules to assert my position. 2. Strategy versus isolation. A fine line. That said, Traoré's strategy, though sharp, is not without risk. Repeated refusals to engage in regional or continental forums may eventually push Burkina Faso further from the mainstream of African politics. Like it or not, multilateral cooperation remains essential for addressing transnational issues such as terrorism, climate change, and regional trade. His continued absence from major platforms may reinforce his image as a principled dissenter, but it also risks earning him the label of uncooperative or diplomatically unpredictable. Without careful balance, his identity-based resistance may start resembling political isolation. 3. The role of media in shaping perceptions. Media coverage both inside and outside Africa has played a critical role in shaping how Traoré's absence is perceived. Western outlets, which often prioritize institutional legitimacy and electoral democracy, tend to frame his actions as indicative of military unpredictability. Meanwhile, independent African media and Pan-African commentators increasingly see him as the face of a new generation willing to walk away from old games and create new rules. Caught between these narratives are audiences pulled between opposing interpretations. This is why content like the video we've just created is so essential. It helps viewers not only understand who didn't show up, but more importantly, why that matters and what message that silence sends. 4. The future of the Traoré model. The central question now is whether Traoré's model, militaristic nationalist and fiercely sovereign, can be sustained long-term. Or is it a short-term reaction to the failure of previous frameworks? African history has seen many leaders rise as liberators, only to fall into authoritarian habits later. For Traoré's path to remain credible, he must prove that his brand of politics rooted in defiance and national pride can also deliver economic stability, public trust, and eventually a peaceful transition of power. This may be his greatest challenge, not just for him, but for the movement he represents. 5. Historical echoes. The legacy of defiant African leaders. Traoré's strategy of symbolic resistance is not unprecedented in African political history. His posture echoes leaders like Thomas Sankara, Kwame Nkrumah, and Patrice Lumumba, figures who also sought to defy imperialism, build independent identities for their nations, and push back against the influence of foreign powers. Like Traoré, these leaders often rejected traditional diplomatic norms, preferring bold ideological declarations of sovereignty. Sankara in particular, Burkina Faso's own revolutionary icon, used both policy and symbolism to challenge the status quo, changing the country's name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of upright people, while rejecting foreign aid he saw as colonial in disguise. But there's a danger in romanticizing these parallels without acknowledging the outcomes. Many of these leaders met tragic ends, overthrown, assassinated, or politically isolated. The structures of global power have remained largely intact, and leaders like Traoré must navigate those realities with a far more sophisticated toolkit if they are to survive and thrive. 6. The Sahel equation. Regional impact and security implications. Burkina Faso's alignment with Mali and Niger in the so-called Alliance of Sahel States has given new momentum to a regional realignment that prioritizes military-led governance, resource nationalism, and distancing from traditional Western influence. This bloc challenges the conventional order upheld by organizations like ECOWAS and the African Union. From a geopolitical standpoint, Traoré's posture, symbolized through acts like boycotting high-profile summits, can inspire similar moves across the Sahel. Leaders disillusioned with ECOWAS or skeptical of French and American military involvement may begin to see the Sahel bloc as a viable alternative power structure. But there are consequences. Security cooperation across the region becomes fragmented. Anti-terror operations risk losing coordination. Shared intelligence systems break down, and as global actors choose sides, Russia backing the Sahel bloc, the West supporting ECOWAS loyalists, the region risks becoming the next front line of a modern Cold War-style proxy dynamic. 7. Domestic resonance, how the message lands at home. Perhaps the most critical arena where Traoré's media strategies take root is at home in Burkina Faso. For a young crisis-born leader like him, legitimacy doesn't come from ballots. It comes from symbolism, from victories real or perceived, and from emotional resonance with the people. By skipping the Nairobi summit, Traoré reinforces a narrative of resistance and sovereignty that plays exceptionally well to his domestic audience. In a country still recovering from decades of instability and fighting insurgencies on multiple fronts, his supporters see him as a protector, not just of the nation's borders, but of its dignity. Traoré also benefits from having near total control of state media, allowing him to shape the interpretation of his decisions. His absence from Nairobi can thus be framed not as diplomatic rejection, but as a courageous act of non-compliance with global hypocrisy, a rejection of performative unity in favor of authentic autonomy. 8. How will the world respond? The international response to Traoré's growing defiance has ranged from cautious silence to open condemnation. While the United States and France have grown increasingly critical, most African governments remain divided, some frustrated by his unpredictability, others quietly admiring his nerve. But the danger for the international community lies in misunderstanding his motives. Treating Traoré solely as a rogue military figure may obscure the ideological undercurrent fueling his popularity. His appeal isn't just nationalist, it's deeply anti-establishment. It feeds on a generational fatigue with traditional diplomacy development aid models and Western-led security frameworks that many Africans feel have failed them. If foreign powers want to engage constructively, they will need new strategies, ones that acknowledge both the material and symbolic dimensions of African politics in 2025. 9. Final reflections, a chair that speaks volumes. Ultimately, the chair that Ibrahim Traoré left empty in Nairobi wasn't empty at all. It was filled with meaning, tension, and provocation. It was a message to his rivals, his allies, and his people. You will talk about me even when I'm not in the room. Whether history will remember that gesture as genius or recklessness depends on what comes next. Can Traoré transform his symbolic defiance into sustainable progress? Can he walk the tightrope between independence and isolation? Can he lead not just a rebellion, but a renaissance? The Nairobi summit may not have answered these questions, but it certainly posed them, and loudly. I am not a politician nor an expert in international relations. I am simply a citizen born and raised in the Sahel, where the red dust lingers in the air and uncertainty clings to every sunrise. For most of my life, we have been told what is good for us. Foreign diplomats with sharp suits, charity workers with kind eyes, military missions bearing flags not our own, all offering solutions yet never asking us what we really needed. So when I heard that President Ibrahim Traoré did not attend the defense summit in Nairobi, I was confused. Was it a mistake? Was it arrogance? I saw the photos of the event generals in full regalia, hands clasped in ceremony, smiling for the cameras, and yet one seat remained empty. The seat for my country. It bothered me at first. Why would our leader not be there when the rest of Africa stood together? But then I listened, I watched, I read, I began to understand. You see, Traoré's absence was not silence. It was a statement. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that our country was speaking not just with words, but with dignity. For years we have watched presidents come and go, some elected, some imposed. We've seen summits come and go, grand speeches followed by quiet inaction. We've signed deals and received aid, but in the villages children still walk miles for water. We host foreign soldiers to protect us from terrorists, but the violence continues. We are promised democracy, but we vote and still feel powerless. When Traoré rose to power, many called him a soldier, not a statesman. Perhaps they were right, but in our eyes, he was someone who did not hide behind scripted speeches. He spoke bluntly, acted decisively, and most of all, he did not kneel. That matters to us. That resonates. The Nairobi summit was filled with powerful people, but among them stood General Michael Langley, representing U.S. military interests in Africa. Just a month before, he had criticized Traoré's government, suggesting our gold reserves were being misused. That may or may not be true, I cannot say. But I do know this: to accuse a sovereign leader and then expect him to sit quietly beside you, smile politely and pretend nothing happened, that is not respect. That is theater. And so Traoré did not go, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because he wanted to speak louder by not speaking at all. Many in the international press criticized him. They called him uncooperative. They said he was isolating himself. But I ask, is it isolation to walk away from a room where you are not welcome? Or is it self-respect? In my village, we were raised to believe that silence can carry weight. When an elder chooses not to speak, it is often because words are not enough. Sometimes to not show up is to show the highest form of protest. Sometimes an empty chair says more than 1,000 declarations. This is not to say Traore is perfect. Far from it. Like many others, I still wait to see if he will truly improve our lives, create jobs, strengthen our schools, and build lasting peace. But I can say this with certainty, for the first time I feel like our leader is not being led. He stands on his own terms. That is powerful in a continent where far too many leaders still seek validation from elsewhere. That is inspiring in a time when African voices are often drowned out by louder, richer, and more global ones. Some say Traore is building a dangerous alliance with Russia with other military regimes, perhaps. These are complicated times, but we've also had decades of Western-backed regimes that left us poor and insecure. If his path is different, let it be judged not by who supports him, but by what he builds. I am not saying we must all follow Traore's example. Africa is diverse, and no single leader represents us all. But I am saying that for once we must listen, not only to what is said, but to what is not. His empty chair in Nairobi is not just a diplomatic absence. It is a mirror. A reflection of what many of us feel, that unity without dignity is not unity at all. So yes, I was confused at first, maybe even embarrassed. But now I am proud. Proud that we did not show up just for the photo. Proud that we are no longer content to sit silently in a room full of scripted applause. Proud that Burkina Faso, my country, is learning to speak in its own voice. Whether that voice will shape a better future remains to be seen. But at least it is ours. The absence of Captain Ibrahim Traoré from the African Defense Summit in Nairobi on May 28, 2025, was not a logistical oversight. It was a carefully calculated political statement. In international diplomacy, silence is seldom accidental. Traoré's decision to leave his chair, empty among 38 of Africa's most powerful military leaders, revealed more about the state of the continent than many speeches could have. It was a moment that demanded not just interpretation, but reflection, a moment that underscored Africa's growing confrontation with competing visions of sovereignty, legitimacy, and geopolitical alignment. First, Traoré's absence served as a critique of the summit's host, Kenya, under President William Ruto. Kenya has positioned itself as a champion of constitutional order and civilian rule, often condemning military takeovers across the continent. This stance stands in direct opposition to Traoré's ascent to power through a military coup. His exclusion from bilateral engagements with Kenya and the absence of any diplomatic warmth between the two leaders reinforce the view that Kenya does not recognize military governments as legitimate. In such a climate, Traoré's physical presence at the Nairobi summit would not have fostered productive dialogue. Instead, it could have undermined his message and exposed him to unnecessary scrutiny and symbolic rejection. By choosing to be absent, he maintained control of his narrative. Secondly, the summit itself was marked by the prominent presence of General Michael Langley, commander of U.S. AFRICOM. Just weeks prior, Langley had publicly accused Traoré of misappropriating Burkina Faso's gold reserves. His remarks sparked widespread protests and anti-U.S. sentiment, not only in Burkina Faso, but across parts of West Africa. To appear at the same summit seated near Langley would have contradicted Traoré's defiant posturing against Western influence. The young Burkinabe leader has built his legitimacy partly on rejecting the legacy of foreign control, military, economic, and diplomatic. His refusal to share a stage with Langley was a continuation of this strategy. It signaled that Burkina Faso would no longer be complicit in diplomatic theater orchestrated by foreign powers. This deliberate silence must be understood as part of a broader communication strategy. Traore is not merely a soldier turned head of state, he is a symbol builder. Every public action or inaction is woven into a broader political narrative of resistance, pride, and independence. Traore's public image draws heavily from the legacy of Thomas Sankara, another military figure who defied imperialism and emphasized national dignity through state-controlled media and regional partnerships. Traore's administration has recast him, not as an isolated actor, but as the voice of a broader Sahelian resistance, a resistance that calls into question the legitimacy of externally funded institutions and demands an African-led alternative. In this context, the empty chair in Nairobi became a message of sovereignty. It told the world that Burkina Faso no longer seeks legitimacy from those who question its path. It reframed exclusion not as weakness, but as autonomy. In the eyes of his supporters, it reinforced the idea that showing up to be marginalized is worse than not showing up at all. In a continent where photo opportunities are often mistaken for progress, his refusal to participate became an act of protest against symbolic unity that lacks substantive change. However, such a strategy is not without risks. Repeated non-engagement with continental forums may isolate Burkina Faso and the broader alliance of Sahel states AES, which includes Mali and Niger. While these nations may find solidarity in shared ideology, they also risk fragmentation in regional security cooperation, trade integration, and diplomatic coordination. Regional organizations such as ECOWAS and the African Union, despite their flaws, remain critical for managing cross-border threats and economic interdependence. Traore's decision to boycott the summit might inspire admiration among his followers, but it could also deepen the divide between AES and the rest of the continent. This brings us to a key lesson. Symbolic politics must eventually intersect with pragmatic governance. Traore's media-savvy approach is effective in rallying support and asserting ideological identity, but the long-term test lies in delivery on security, economic resilience, and social development. The symbolic rejection of Nairobi's summit may inspire resistance movements, but if it fails to deliver concrete improvements in daily life, the resonance will fade. Populations, no matter how inspired by pride, still require food, jobs, and stability. Yet in the short term, this form of symbolic defiance has struck a chord with many Africans, especially the youth. Traore's stance speaks to a generation disillusioned by years of dependency, corruption, and elite complicity with foreign interests. His refusal to engage with summits, perceived as performative, echoes a deeper desire among Africans to stop merely participating in structures that do not serve them and begin building new ones. The rise of movements that see Burkina Faso's current path as a blueprint suggests a growing hunger for alternatives. This disillusionment also reflects a shifting continental dynamic. Many African leaders still operate within frameworks established by international donors, development institutions, and military agreements with the West. Traore's refusal to participate in such frameworks raises difficult questions. Can Africa define its own terms? Can military governments deliver better than democratic ones? And what does true sovereignty look like in an age of global interdependence? His absence forces these conversations into the mainstream, whether his critics like it or not. Furthermore, the response to Traore's absence highlights the role of perception in diplomacy. Western media interpreted his non-attendance as evidence of unpredictability and diplomatic immaturity. Conversely, Pan-African commentators viewed it as a principled stand against foreign hegemony. These competing narratives underscore how Africa's political fault lines are now as much about ideology and symbolism as about governance. In this environment, the politics of presence and absence, who shows up where and with whom, has become central to projecting national identity. Another dimension often overlooked is the domestic impact of such international gestures. Within Burkina Faso, Traore's silence at Nairobi was interpreted not as detachment but as strength. In a nation grappling with terrorism, economic hardship, and foreign pressure, The idea of a leader who does not bow, literally or figuratively, carries emotional power. His supporters see him as a protector of dignity, someone who refuses to be humiliated on the world stage. That matters in a society long subjected to the humiliation of poverty amidst natural wealth. Finally, this story is a reminder that diplomacy in the 21st century is no longer confined to summits and treaties. It is also about media images and public perception. In the digital age, silence can trend, and a vacant seat can go viral. Traore has embraced this reality, using every moment presence or absence as an opportunity to shape his image and message. Whether one agrees with his politics or not, it is clear that he understands the theater of power. In conclusion, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's decision not to attend the Nairobi summit was more than a refusal. It was a redefinition of what it means to lead in an Africa that is no longer content with borrowed legitimacy. It was a risk, certainly, but also a declaration. That empty chair did not represent isolation. It represented a new way of being seen. Whether this path will ultimately strengthen Burkina Faso or leave it diplomatically adrift remains to be seen. But the lesson is clear in a continent still fighting to reclaim its voice. Sometimes silence is the loudest form of leadership.